Emma, tired after the long journey, tossed her keys onto the table and looked around the house she had inherited from her aunt, who had passed away several months ago. The house was old, neglected, but charming in its own way. 2 stories tall, with large windows that overlooked the forest. Her aunt had lived here for many years in solitude, and although they rarely saw each other, Emma knew that her aunt was somewhat strange. In her last letters, she had written about something being wrong with the house, but Emma dismissed it as the whims of an elderly woman. For the first few days, Emma enjoyed the peace and quiet. Her old life seemed far away. The noisy city, the endless work stress, the constant pressure. Here in this forgotten corner of the world, she could finally relax and be alone with her thoughts. During the day, sunlight flooded the house, and the forest around it seemed calm, even welcoming. But at night, everything changed. As dusk fell, the silence became unsettling. The forest, which by day felt alive and vibrant, turned into something ominous in the dark. The branches of the trees scratched at the windows like claws, and Emma began to notice strange sounds, faint, barely perceptible, as if someone or something was walking around the house. A few days after moving in, Emma felt truly uncomfortable for the first time. It was late in the evening, and she was about to go to bed when she heard the first knock on the window. At first, she thought it was just the wind or some random noise, but soon the sound repeated. A faint scraping, as if something was dragging claws across the glass. Outside, there was only darkness. No signs of life, just trees and thick gloom that seemed to swallow all light. Emma stood frozen for several minutes, staring into the night, before finally stepping back and convincing herself it was just her imagination. She returned to bed, but her sleep was restless. The next morning, Emma decided to distract herself from her troubling thoughts by going to the local shop in the nearby village. The small, quiet settlement seemed friendly. The shopkeeper, a middle-aged woman with a kind face, smiled when she saw the new resident. "You're staying in old Mrs. Wilkins' house, aren't you?" she asked. Emma nodded as she gathered her groceries. But the woman's smile quickly faded, and her expression became serious. "I've heard there's something not right with that house," she whispered. "People say strange things happen there. I wouldn't advise staying there alone at night." Emma laughed nervously, unsure of how to respond, but the woman's words stuck with her. They circled in her mind all day as she drove home along the narrow road flanked by forest. That evening, still shaken by the conversation in the shop, Emma decided to invite her friends to stay over for the weekend. She texted Mike and Sarah, her close friends whom she hadn't seen in a while. Mike and Sarah agreed, and 2 days later, they arrived at the old house. Emma felt a sense of relief that she was no longer alone in this desolate, strange place. The reunion was warm and cheerful as always. "This house looks like the perfect setting for a horror movie," Mike joked, eyeing the large windows and worn walls. "If anything, I'll be the first one to run." Sarah laughed, but it seemed something about the house unsettled her too. They made dinner, drank some wine, and enjoyed the evening. All the tension seemed to melt away. Emma almost stopped thinking about the strange noises and visions that had haunted her. But as the night once again enveloped the house, the fear returned. Late at night, Emma was awakened by the familiar knock. It was the same sound as before, quiet, insistent, the scraping on the glass. She froze, standing in the middle of the living room, too afraid to approach the window. At that moment, She heard a rustling sound just outside the glass, and her breath caught in her throat. She knew someone was out there. Unable to take it any longer, Emma yanked the curtains aside. A man was standing there. His face was distorted, hidden by shadow, but he was right outside the window, staring at her. His face had no eyes, only dark, endless voids. Emma screamed and jumped back, closing the curtains. Her heart pounded wildly, and she couldn't believe what she had just seen. This wasn't a dream, wasn't her imagination. He was there. In the morning, Emma tried to tell her friends what had happened, but they brushed it off. Mike smirked, and Sarah tried to comfort her, saying it was probably just a dream. "You're just tired, Em," Mike said, sipping his coffee. "It's an old house. It makes a lot of weird noises. Maybe you just imagined it." Emma shook her head. She knew it wasn't a dream. He had been at the window. She tried to forget about it, but by evening the fear began to rise in her chest again. As night fell, every creak, every rustle made her more tense. This time, Emma couldn't sleep. She listened to every sound, her body tensing with each small creak of the house. And again, near midnight, the scraping began. But this time it was louder, closer. Emma jumped out of bed and headed for the window. "Sarah! Mike!" Emma shouted, but no one answered. The figure didn't move. It just stood there staring at her with its empty eyes. Panicking, Emma ran from the room, banging on her friends' doors. But by the time Mike and Sarah came out of their rooms, the figure was gone. Emma pointed to the window, but there was nothing there. The forest outside was calm, the night eerily silent. "There's no one here, Emma," Mike said irritably, clearly tired of her fears. Sarah hugged her, trying to soothe her. "You're not alone. If something happens, we're here," she said. But Emma knew no one believed her. Each night, the entity came closer. Emma saw it at every window, felt its presence as she sat in the dark. It seemed to mock her, appearing and disappearing, leaving no trace. On the last night when Emma heard the scraping again, she didn't run to the window. She couldn't bring herself to look. But the footsteps, they weren't outside anymore. The footsteps echoed down the hallway, coming closer to her door. And as the door slowly creaked open, Emma realized it wasn't outside anymore. It was inside. Artem wasn't the type to believe in mysticism or anything supernatural. He lived in a modern world where it seemed everything had a logical explanation. He worked as a photographer, and his new smartphone with an excellent camera had been a real find, allowing him to capture high-quality images even in the most unexpected places. One evening, Artem decided to take a walk through an abandoned park that lay far from the city's noise. The park had been neglected for years, nearly forgotten, with overgrown weeds winding around old rides and benches. It seemed like the perfect place for a moody photo shoot, he thought. As the sun dipped lower, Artem pulled out his phone, activated the camera, and began capturing images of the broken-down rides, decaying benches, and street lamps. The photos looked like scenes from a post-apocalyptic movie, empty, desolate, filled with sorrow. But when he snapped a picture of an old lamppost, he noticed something strange on the screen. A figure, a human silhouette, translucent and blurred, was standing a little way off. Artem couldn't see anything unusual in front of him. This figure was only visible on his phone's screen. He frowned, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. "What the hell?" he muttered, moving the camera closer to the strange spot. But as soon as he aimed the camera at the figure again, it disappeared. The park looked as empty as before. Artem shrugged, deciding it must have been a trick of the light, and continued taking photos. But a slight unease had settled in, making it hard to enjoy the shoot. The next day, Artem returned to the park, this time deliberately aiming his camera at spots that had seemed strange the day before. He checked every corner, every object, hoping to catch another glimpse of the ghostly shape. And soon enough, it appeared again. Now the figure on his screen looked like a tall man in an old-fashioned hat, his face obscured by shadows. He stood motionless, staring directly at Artem through the screen, his gaze empty and cold. Artem felt goosebumps rising on his skin. Unable to control his nerves, he lowered his phone and looked around. He felt that someone, or something, was nearby, hiding at the edge of visibility, waiting to be noticed. But without the camera, he saw no one. This strange man existed only through his phone's lens. Artem decided to approach and aimed his camera at the figure again. But the closer he got, the blurrier the image became until finally the silhouette faded away completely. When he reached the spot where the figure had been standing, he felt a sudden chill in the air, despite the warm summer evening. He shivered, still trying to comprehend what was happening, but something inside him urged him to leave. Despite his fear, Artem couldn't leave the place alone. The following evening, he decided to walk along the old sideshow tent located on the edge of the park. This pavilion was adorned with elaborate carvings and peeling paint, as if it had once been the heart of a fairground or carnival. Now it stood abandoned, consumed by nature. Artem turned on his camera and started filming. As soon as the outlines of the tent appeared on the screen, he saw the shadows once again. This time, there were different figures. A small girl in an old-fashioned dress, a woman in a long, dark coat, and a man with a mustache, lurking in the shadows with burning eyes that looked like embers. The girl seemed to be staring right at him, while the woman tilted her head slightly, as if she recognized him. A chill ran down Artem's spine. These ghostly figures didn't move, but they emanated a sinister energy, as if they were watching him, wanting to get closer. He took a step toward them, holding the camera in front of him, but as he approached, the figures began to blur like mist, and in a moment, they were gone. Artem lowered his phone, feeling the heavy weight of the air around him. His heart was racing, and he was almost afraid to breathe. It felt as though unseen eyes were still watching him. After that evening, Artem tried to forget about what had happened. He realized he was becoming almost obsessed with returning to the abandoned park, where strange ghostly figures appeared on his phone's screen. He shared his experiences with a friend, but his friend only laughed and suggested it was probably a glitch in the camera. But Artem knew that wasn't true. The figures were too clear, too real. The next night, he returned to the park, hoping to capture something else and prove to himself that these weren't hallucinations. At first, everything seemed calm, with no strange shadows. But when he reached the park center, where an old fountain stood, his camera once again picked up something strange. A figure appeared on the screen, a man in a dark coat standing several meters away, staring directly into the camera. Artem couldn't see him with the naked eye, but the figure was clear on his screen, as though he were standing right there in front of him. "Who are you?" Artem whispered, not expecting an answer. But an answer came. In the silence around him, he heard a faint whisper. "I'm here because you called me." The words echoed in his head. Artem jumped back, trying to turn off the camera, but his fingers were trembling, and the screen continued showing the figure. It was moving, coming closer, and its face became visible. Pale, lifeless, chilling. Artem bolted, not daring to look back. It felt as though every step echoed behind him, as if someone was following, watching his every move. Artem didn't know how to explain what was happening. He was sure the visions on his phone screen were real, even if he couldn't see the figures himself. Desperate to understand, he began researching the park's history and came across several old newspaper articles. He discovered that many years ago, several people had disappeared in that park. Among them were a young girl, a woman in a long coat, and a man last seen near the sideshow tent. The police never found any trace of their disappearance, and the park was soon closed. Artem realized that these were the people he had seen on his phone screen. But the most terrifying discovery awaited him. In one of the articles, there was mention of a man in a dark coat who was supposedly seen following the missing people. He was last seen near the fountain, standing in the shadows. Artem understood that the figure that had approached him in the park was this very man. He didn't know why the man's spirit kept appearing, but one thing was clear. This ghost was determined to take him. He had come back to finish what he'd started years ago. On his final night, Artem returned to the park, determined to face whatever was haunting him. He felt that these restless spirits would not leave him alone until he faced them head-on. The moment he stepped onto the path leading to the old fountain, he turned on his camera. The figures were everywhere. The girl stood by the edge of the path. The woman stood further off in the shadows of the trees. But the most terrifying figure, the man in the coat, was standing by the fountain, staring straight at him. "What do you want?" Artem asked, his voice trembling. Suddenly he heard the reply, "You came to our place. Now you are one of us." In horror, he pointed the camera at himself, and on the screen he saw his own reflection. But it looked strange. His skin was pale, his eyes had turned dark like those of the ghosts he'd seen. The phone slipped from his hands, and the silence of the park closed in around him. Artem realized he was no longer alone. The first few nights were strange but not terrifying. I would wake up for no reason in the middle of the night, feeling a vague sense of discomfort. It was like those moments when you wake up unexpectedly and can't figure out why. The room was silent, disturbed only by the sound of the wind outside the window. I couldn't see anything, but the feeling of unease was growing. I tried to dismiss it as stress or fatigue. I've been overworking, I thought. But on the third night, something changed. I woke up again, and this time my heart clenched with inexplicable fear. The room was dark, with only faint moonlight filtering through the curtains, and that's when I saw him. In the corner of the room, across from my bed, stood a figure. Black, motionless, as if carved from the shadows of the night. My breathing quickened. At first I thought it might be my coat or bag left on a chair, but it was too tall, too wrong. I froze. My heart started pounding furiously. "It's just a shadow," I tried to convince myself. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and decided morning would clear everything up. But even with my eyes closed, I could feel him there. In the morning, I tried to forget what I had seen. I convinced myself it was just an illusion brought on by exhaustion. Maybe I had imagined it, but each time the fear grew stronger. On the fourth night, I deliberately left the light on. I thought that would help. Light was supposed to chase away the darkness, and with it, my nocturnal visions. But even with the light, he was there. I opened my eyes closer to 3 a.m. and saw him again. This time, he stood even closer. His figure was just as tall, but now it seemed he was leaning slightly forward, as if trying to get a better look at me. My breathing became shallow. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. I wanted to get up, but my body felt glued to the bed. And then I heard it. A faint rustle, as if someone barely... Now every night I waited for him to appear. The waiting became torture. I lay in bed with only one thought: he's coming. And he came. Every time he was closer. At first he just stood in the corner. Then I began to hear his footsteps. They were slow but heavy, as though the floorboards were bending under his weight. Step, then another. I shut my eyes, but that only made it worse. I could feel his presence with my whole body. I tried telling my friends about it, but no one believed me. "You're just tired," they said. "It's stress," others added. But I knew it was real. On the sixth night he spoke. The whisper was barely audible, as if coming from another world. His words were fragmented, but I made out a few. "You see me." I screamed and covered my ears, but the sound kept echoing in my head. The light in the room wasn't enough. I turned on my desk lamp, my phone's flashlight, anything I could find. It seemed to help. For a while he was gone. But when I lay down again, I felt the cold. The air grew heavy, as though something was draining all the warmth from the room. And that's when I realized he was still there. I could no longer sleep in my room. On the seventh night, I decided to stay on the couch in the living room. The light there was brighter, and I felt safer. But even that didn't help. Around midnight, I began to drift off. My sleep was restless and fragmented, and then I felt him again. When I opened my eyes, I saw him. This time, he stood by the living room window, right behind the glass. His outline was sharp, as though he had stepped out of the shadows to watch me. I ran back to my room, slamming the door shut. For a moment, I felt safe. But when night fell again, he returned. I decided to record everything on camera. I set up my phone on a tripod, aiming it at the corner of the room where he always appeared. When the clock struck 3, I heard his footsteps again. The figure appeared in the corner. At first it was blurry, but over time it grew more defined. I watched the phone's screen, trying to convince myself it wasn't real. And then his eyes began to glow red. The phone started glitching. The screen dimmed, and the recording cut off. I rushed to grab the device, but its battery was completely drained, even though I had charged it to 100% before bed. On the last night, I refused to sleep. I sat on my bed, trembling, clutching a flashlight in my hands. He appeared later than usual, but I already knew he would come. This time, he stood at the very edge of my bed. "Why?" I whispered, barely daring to lift my head. His whisper grew louder. It was no longer fragmented. "You came to me. Now you will stay." And then he reached out his hand. Long, thin, pale, it stretched toward my face. I wanted to scream, but a lump caught in my throat. My eyes locked on his glowing red eyes, which grew brighter as though they were igniting. At that moment, I felt something cold touch my cheek, and I lost consciousness. I woke up in the morning, lying on the floor. Everything in the room looked as it always did, but the sense of dread hadn't left me. I checked the recording on my phone. It showed me tossing and turning in bed. Then at 3 o'clock, the figure appeared in the corner. But just as it began to approach, the recording abruptly ended. Now I can't sleep. Every night he comes closer, and one day I know he will take me. Daniel always found night drives calming. There was something soothing about long stretches of road, dark forests lining the edges, and the rare glow of oncoming headlights. For him, it was a time to think, disconnect from the day's chaos, and be alone with his thoughts. Tonight, he was driving home after a late visit to a friend in a neighboring town. The clock showed it was almost 2 a.m., and the road was deserted. The radio played softly in the background, filling the silence with mellow tunes. In the distance, the outline of a dense forest began to emerge, stretching endlessly along the highway. Forests always look strange at night. The trees seemed taller, their branches more twisted, as if warped by time. But Daniel had long since gotten used to these night drives through the wilderness. This time, however, something felt off. He didn't immediately understand what it was, but the unease crept under his skin. Glancing at the rearview mirror, he noticed his car's taillights reflecting differently. Something flickered in the darkness, barely perceptible. Probably just overthinking, he muttered to himself, focusing back on the road. But the further he drove into the forest, the stronger the feeling became. An eerie sensation that someone or something was watching him. A few minutes later, Daniel noticed headlights in his rearview mirror. It was rare to see another car on this empty road. Someone was driving behind him, keeping a steady distance. At first, he thought it was just another late traveler. But after a few kilometers, the car was still there, maintaining the same gap. Daniel slowed down, giving the driver a chance to pass him. But the car behind him slowed as well. He sped up, and the headlights mirrored his pace. His palms grew sweaty. Just a coincidence, he thought, though deep down he didn't believe it. The headlights were too bright, almost blinding. Daniel decided to turn off the main road, veering onto a narrow dirt path, hoping the car behind him would simply continue straight. But the car followed. "Okay, maybe it's just a coincidence," he muttered, his voice trembling. He kept driving, taking more random turns, but the headlights never disappeared. They didn't get closer, but they didn't fall behind either. The panic inside him began to rise. Daniel tried to make out who was behind the wheel. Squinting into the rearview mirror, he strained to see the driver's silhouette. But the face behind the windshield was too dark, blending with the shadows. He couldn't discern any features or movement. The glaring headlights moved closer, nearly blinding him. A throbbing pain pulsed in his temples, and his slippery hands struggled to grip the wheel. "What do you want?" he shouted into the empty car, though he knew no one would answer. The headlights flickered. In that moment, Daniel noticed the road ahead narrowing. There were no signs, no intersections, just a thin path leading deeper into the forest. His chest tightened. The air inside the car seemed heavier, harder to breathe. Unable to take it anymore, Daniel slammed on the brakes. The engine cut off, and the sound of silence enveloped him. The headlights behind him turned off. He opened the door and stepped outside. The forest was impenetrably dark. The The shadows consumed everything, and only the moonlight faintly illuminated the twisted trees, casting long, grotesque shadows. Behind him stood the car. Daniel squinted, trying to make out the driver. The doors were shut, the windows rolled up. No one got out. "Hey, what do you want?" he yelled, but the silence remained unbroken. A shiver ran down his spine, and instinctively he took a step back toward his car. Then he heard a creak. The door of the other car opened. A foot stepped out, followed by another. A tall man in a long coat emerged. His face was obscured by shadows, but something about his movements froze Daniel in place. The man didn't rush. He walked slowly, each step deliberate, closing the distance between them. "Stop. I'll call the police." Daniel fumbled for his phone, only to find there was no signal. The man continued to approach, stopping just a few meters away. "What do you want?" Daniel repeated, his voice trembling. There was no answer. The man raised his head, and Daniel finally saw his face, or rather, the lack of it. Where eyes, a nose, and a mouth should have been, there was only smooth, pale skin, as if it had been sculpted from wax. "You entered a forest that does not belong to you," a cold voice said, though the man's lips did not move. Daniel stumbled backward, his back hitting the car door. He wanted to run, but his legs felt rooted to the ground. "I don't understand. I was just driving home," he began, but the man's voice cut him off. "This is your home now." Suddenly, the shadows around him began to shift. The forest was coming alive. Tree branches stretched toward him like black hands, and the ground beneath him trembled. Daniel screamed, but his voice was swallowed by the thick, suffocating air. He tried to open his car door, but it was locked. Around him, rustling noises grew louder, footsteps that belonged to no one. The man stood motionless, yet his presence filled the entire space. "You will not return," the man said. "Everyone who enters becomes part of the forest." Daniel felt his legs sinking into the ground. His skin began to harden, growing rough and rigid like tree bark. He screamed again, but the sound grew weaker, like the wind rustling through leaves. When it was over, the forest fell silent once more. Where Daniel had stood, there was now a tree. Its branches resembled outstretched arms, and its bark looked eerily like human skin. The moonlight illuminated it as if mocking him. A few nights later, another car drove down the same road. A young woman, returning home, slowed her vehicle when she noticed a strange tree at the edge of the forest. It looked almost like a person, with a face frozen in a silent scream. She stopped to get a closer look, and in her rearview mirror, 2 bright headlights appeared. Grandma's house stood on the edge of a small village, right next to the forest. It always seemed old, even when I was a child. The gray, weather-worn wooden siding and dusty, cloudy windows gave it a timeless, eerie aura. This was the house where my father had grown up, and my brother Dima and I had spent many of our summers there. We loved it. An expansive home filled with endless nooks for playing, a dusty attic brimming with treasures, and a basement that seemed to stretch into shadowy depths. But as we grew older, our feelings about the house began to change. What once seemed like a magical place of adventure became unsettling. Small details we had ignored as children began to catch our attention. Creaking floorboards, the faint sound of movement in empty rooms, shadows that didn't seem to belong. And then there was Grandma's behavior. We visited every summer without fail, but that last summer changed everything. When we arrived, Grandma greeted us with her usual smile and homemade pies. But later, as we settled in, her demeanor shifted. Her expression turned serious, and her tone became hushed. "Children," she said, her voice almost a whisper, "if you hear footsteps in the hallway at night, don't leave your room." Her words hung in the air, and Dima chuckled nervously, thinking she was teasing us. But her stern gaze didn't waver. Dima and I exchanged uneasy looks, and a knot of anxiety began forming in my stomach. The first night passed uneventfully. The house enveloped us in its usual silence, and the comforting smell of dried herbs and lavender lulled us to sleep. We spent the next day exploring the attic, leafing through old family albums and marveling at the peculiar trinkets Grandma had collected over the years. By evening, her strange warning was almost forgotten. But on the second night, I woke to a strange sound. At first, I thought it was the rustling of leaves outside, but then I realized it was coming from the hallway. Quiet, deliberate footsteps creaked across the old wooden floorboards. They were heavy and slow, as if someone was moving carefully, trying not to be noticed. My body stiffened, and I felt my heart start to race. Turning my head, I saw that Dima was awake too. His wide eyes stared at the ceiling, and I knew he'd heard it too. Neither of us said a word. We just lay there, frozen, listening as the footsteps drew closer. They stopped right outside our door. We held our breath, waiting, expecting something or someone to enter. But after a long, agonizing moment, the footsteps resumed, retreating back down the hallway until the house fell silent once more. The next morning, we tried to tell Grandma about what we'd heard. She dismissed it with a wave of her hand, saying it was just the house settling, but I saw the flicker of worry in her eyes, a shadow that told me she knew more than she was letting on. That afternoon, while Grandma was busy in the kitchen, Dima suggested we explore the second floor. We'd always known there was a room up there we weren't allowed to enter. Grandma had told us it belonged to our late grandfather, who had passed away long before we were born. The door to that room was always locked, and Grandma kept the key hidden. But today, to our surprise, the door was slightly ajar. We exchanged uncertain glances before Dima, curiosity getting the better of him, pushed it open. The room greeted us with a cold, musty air, as if it had been sealed for decades. Everything inside was untouched. A rocking chair by the window, a shelf of old books, and a coat hanging on a peg near the door. It was as though Grandpa might walk in at any moment. In the corner of the room stood a large mirror, draped in a heavy cloth. Dima, always the braver of us, crossed the room and pulled the cloth away. At first, all we saw was our own reflection, the two of us staring back at ourselves with wide eyes. But then, something changed. Behind us, in the mirror, a blurry shape began to form. It grew clearer by the second, resolving into the figure of a man. He wore a long coat and an old-fashioned hat, just like Grandpa in the photographs. But where his face should have been, there was only darkness, a gaping void that seemed to draw the light from the room. We bolted, slamming the door shut behind us and not stopping until we were back downstairs, our hearts pounding. Neither of us said a word about what we'd seen, but the fear in Dima's eyes mirrored my own. That evening, as Grandma came to say goodnight, her face was drawn, as though she knew something had happened. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, then repeated her warning from the first night. "Children, if you hear footsteps tonight, do not open your door. No matter what you hear, stay in your room." Her tone was grave, and this time, neither of us dared to laugh it off. I could see that even Dima, who usually brushed off such things, was deeply unsettled. We nodded silently and climbed into bed. The house felt different that night. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the wooden beams seemed louder, more deliberate. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, too afraid to close my eyes. I could hear Dima shifting restlessly in his bed, and I knew he was just as scared as I was. The footsteps started earlier that night, before we'd even fallen asleep. They were heavier now, more purposeful, and this time they began right outside our door. We could hear them moving slowly, pausing at each room, as if searching for something or someone. When the footsteps reached our door, they stopped. The silence was suffocating. My chest tightened as I watched the door, half expecting it to burst open. Then, with an agonizing creak, it began to slowly swing inward. Dima and I froze, too terrified to move or make a sound. A figure stood in the doorway, its silhouette backlit by the dim light of the hallway. It was the same figure we had seen in the mirror. Grandpa's coat, Grandpa's hat, but no face. Just an empty void where a face should have been. The room grew colder, and the air felt thick, as if the house itself was holding its breath. The figure didn't move. It simply stood there watching, or so it seemed, though it had no eyes. Time felt as though it had stopped, and I wasn't sure how long we sat there, paralyzed with fear. Finally, the figure turned and drifted back into the hallway, and the door closed softly behind it. The next morning, neither of us mentioned what had happened. Grandma didn't ask, but her silence spoke volumes. She seemed to know, and her weary eyes suggested this was not the first time something like this had occurred. We packed our bags and left that very day, without looking back. After that summer, we never returned to Grandma's house. Whenever our parents suggested visiting, I would make up an excuse, and Dima would quietly agree. Neither of us wanted to set foot in that place again. Years passed, and Grandma eventually moved in with us. The house, left abandoned, began to crumble, overtaken by the forest at its edge. But sometimes when I close my eyes, I still see that shadowy figure in the doorway. Its faceless head turned toward me, waiting. And I know it's still there, in that house at the edge of the village, standing in the hallway, listening for footsteps. Years later, after Grandma had passed away, I was faced with a difficult choice. The house was still in our family's name, but it had fallen into disrepair. My parents asked if I wanted to visit the house one last time before it was sold or demolished. I hesitated. Memories of that final summer haunted me, but a part of me felt compelled to go back, to face whatever had happened there, and finally put it behind me. I decided to go alone. The village hadn't changed much. The winding road leading to the house was overgrown, and when I reached the property, it was almost unrecognizable. The garden was now a tangle of weeds, and the house looked even more decrepit, its once sturdy walls sagging under the weight of time. The windows were dark and lifeless, but they seemed to watch me as I approached. I stood on the porch for what felt like an eternity, gathering my courage. Finally, I pushed the door open, and the familiar smell of dust and decay greeted me. The house was eerily quiet, but every step I took echoed like a shout. The house felt different. The warmth it once held, even in its strangeness, was gone. Now it was just cold and empty. I wandered through the rooms, remembering the laughter and stories Grandma used to share. The kitchen was filled with cobwebs, the furniture covered in layers of dust. When I reached the second floor, I stopped in front of the forbidden room. The door was shut, just as we'd left it years ago. For a moment, I considered leaving it alone, but something urged me to go in, as if I was being drawn to it one final time. The door creaked open, and the room looked just as it had before. Grandpa's chair, his books, and that ominous mirror still covered with the same old cloth. The air in the room was heavy, almost suffocating, and I felt an irrational sense of dread. I stepped closer to the mirror, my heart pounding. My hand trembled as I reached for the cloth, hesitating. Why was I doing this? Why couldn't I just leave? Finally, I pulled the cloth away. At first, it was just my reflection, older now, tired, but unmistakably me. Then, just like before, the shadow appeared behind me. It was faint at first, but it grew clearer with each passing second. The same figure, Grandpa's coat and hat, the void where a face should have been. But this time, it moved. I watched in horror as the figure stepped closer in the reflection. My breath caught as I realized it wasn't just in the mirror. It was behind me, in the room. The air turned icy, and I could feel its presence, heavy and oppressive. "Why did you come back?" a voice whispered, though I couldn't tell if it came from the figure or from the walls themselves. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. The figure reached out, its hand dark and undefined, and I felt a cold, bone-deep chill as it touched my shoulder. My vision blurred, and for a moment I thought I saw something, a memory that wasn't mine. A younger version of Grandpa, standing in this room, arguing with someone I couldn't see. There was anger, desperation, and then nothing. The figure in the mirror seemed to grow taller, more imposing, as if feeding on my fear. My legs finally obeyed me, and I stumbled backward, knocking over a chair as I fled from the room. The door slammed shut behind me on its own, and I didn't dare look back. I ran downstairs, my mind racing. I had to leave, to escape this house and never come back. But as I reached the front door, it wouldn't budge. I pulled and yanked, but it was as if the house itself had locked me in. The whispers started again, this time all around me, coming from the walls, the ceiling, the floor. They overlapped, growing louder until they were almost deafening. "Leave, stay, help us. You shouldn't have come." Desperately, I turned back toward the hallway, and there it was again, the figure. It stood at the bottom of the stairs, motionless, watching. But this time, there were others. Faint shadows flickered in and out of existence around it, like echoes of people who had once been here. I realized then that the house wasn't just haunted by Grandpa. It was haunted by the weight of the past, by memories and regrets that had festered for years. And now, I was a part of it. With a surge of adrenaline, I ran past the figure, avoiding its outstretched hand, and hurled myself at a window. The glass shattered around me as I tumbled onto the overgrown lawn. I didn't stop running until I was back at my car. I never told my parents what happened that day. When they asked, I said the house was too far gone, not worth keeping. It was sold to someone who planned to tear it down, and I made sure I wasn't there to see it happen. But even now, I dream of that house. I see the hallway, the forbidden room, and the shadows that waited for me. I hear the whispers, faint but insistent, calling me back. Sometimes I wonder if the house is truly gone, or if somewhere in that quiet village it still stands, waiting for its next visitor. On the quiet outskirts of a small town where each house stood far apart from its neighbors, there was a home labeled as number 17. A young couple, Emily and Mark Davis lived there. Their house, surrounded by dense trees, was often called the most secluded spot in the area. When they bought it, friends joked that it was the perfect setting for a horror movie. But the Davises just laughed. Emily even took pictures of the old, peeling facade and posted them online with hashtags like #CozyHome. They enjoyed the solitude until that rainy night when something disturbed their peace. It was around 2 a.m. when Emily awoke to a strange sound. It was soft but persistent, like something scraping against glass. She opened her eyes and listened. The bedroom was silent, with only the sound of rain tapping against the windows. "Mark, do you hear that?" she whispered, nudging her husband. Mark groggily muttered something incomprehensible and turned over. Emily felt a growing sense of unease. She got out of bed, cautiously approached the window, and pulled back the heavy curtain. The darkness outside was almost palpable, like a thick fog. But in the glow of the street lamp, she noticed something peculiar. A figure standing at the edge of their yard. A tall man in a long coat and hat. He was just standing there, motionless. Emily frowned. Maybe it's a neighbor, she thought. But what would a neighbor be doing out here at 2 a.m.? She quickly drew the curtain and returned to bed, but sleep evaded her. It felt like the tension in the air was thickening by the minute. A little while later, there came a new sound. A faint knock at the door. Once, then twice. "Mark, wake up!" Emily shook her husband, her voice now filled with panic. "Someone's knocking at the door." He groggily sat up, muttering in annoyance. "Probably some teenagers playing pranks. I'll go check." Mark got out of bed and headed for the front door, flipping the light switch in the hallway on his way. Emily followed close behind, her chest tightening with fear. When Mark opened the door, there was no one there. Only the cool, rainy night greeted him. "No one's here. I told you, it's just a prank," he grumbled, closing the door and securing the chain. But before they could return to their bedroom, the knocking started again, louder this time. The door rattled, as though someone was trying to force their way inside. Mark frowned. "Who's there?" he shouted. There was no reply. Instead, a new sound came from the other side of the house, knocking on the kitchen window. Emily felt goosebumps rise on her skin. "We need to call the police," she said, her voice trembling. Mark nodded, but before he could grab his phone, the entire house plunged into darkness. The darkness seemed to swallow everything. Emily froze, her breathing quickening. Somewhere far off, the rain continued its soft drumming, but inside the house, silence reigned. "Damn it," Mark cursed. "The fuse must have blown." "No, Mark," Emily whispered, her voice shaking. "This isn't an accident." Her words went unanswered. Mark felt around on the shelf near the door and found the flashlight. A narrow beam of light cut through the darkness, but instead of providing comfort, it only deepened the oppressive shadows around them. "Stay here. I'll check the breaker," he said, heading toward the basement. "You're leaving me alone?" Emily grabbed his arm tightly. "I'll be back in a minute." Emily watched as he disappeared down the hallway, her mind betraying her by conjuring the worst scenarios. Left alone, she strained her ears for any sound. Somewhere, glass creaked again as if being scratched by nails. But the most terrifying sound came from the living room, where the large glass door led to the backyard. She raised the flashlight and pointed it toward the source of the noise. The beam revealed something that made her heart stop. A hand. A pale, long hand covered in dirt, slowly scraping the glass. And then Emily saw the face. It was twisted, with a grotesque smile, as though the skin had been stretched tightly over a skull. Its eyes, black as the void, stared directly at her. "Mark!" Emily screamed, but her voice broke. The face behind the glass tilted its head, studying her reaction. Then it raised a finger and tapped on the glass 3 times. Knock, knock, knock. Meanwhile, Mark descended the stairs to the basement, using the flashlight to guide his way. The basement always gave him an uneasy feeling. Old pipes, cobwebs, and dust created the impression that this part of the house existed in another dimension. When he reached the breaker box, it was clear something was wrong. The wires had been ripped out. Mark leaned closer to inspect the damage and suddenly felt something cold brush against his neck. He whipped around, but no one was there. "Who's there?" He shouted, fear creeping into his voice. There was no answer, but then he heard footsteps. First one, then another. They were coming closer from the farthest corner of the basement. His flashlight revealed a dark figure. It was tall and thin, but its face was obscured by shadows. It took another step and Mark froze, unable to move. The figure began whispering, but its words sounded strange, as though the voice came from the air around him rather than the figure itself. "You should have left." Mark grabbed the nearest pipe and without thinking bolted toward the stairs. But the way was blocked. On the top step stood another figure, as if waiting for him. Emily still stood in the living room, her eyes glued to the creature outside the glass. It suddenly froze, then vanished into the darkness, as if dissolving. Emily knew this wasn't her imagination. But where was Mark? Why hadn't he returned? A loud noise shattered her thoughts. Something heavy had fallen in the basement. Then Mark's voice erupted, filled with terror. "Emily, run!" Her body froze in fear. Instead of fleeing, she stood rooted to the spot, clutching the flashlight. Footsteps echoed behind her. She turned and saw a shadow slip along the wall. Someone was inside the house. "Mark, is that you?" she whispered, though she already knew it wasn't him. The footsteps drew closer, and suddenly the beam of her flashlight illuminated a figure. It was the creature she had seen through the glass. It stood before her, its head tilted to the side as if asking, "Why are you still here?" The creature took a step forward and Emily screamed. Emily's scream shattered the silence, piercing the night. The creature advanced, its grotesque face illuminated by the weak flashlight. Emily grabbed the nearest object, a glass candle holder, and hurled it at the monster. It flinched, giving her a fleeting moment to act. She bolted for the front door, not caring that she was barefoot or that the rain outside would drench her. Her trembling fingers struggled with the chain lock, but then she heard a voice behind her, low and cold. "Leave it. You're not going anywhere." Emily spun around, but no one was there. Only her own reflection in the window stared back at her, distorted by the rain. But it moved differently than she did. It tilted its head to the side, just like the monster. Finally, the chain gave way, and Emily flung the door open, running into the night. Rain lashed against her face, and the wind chilled her to the bone. She ran down the narrow path leading to the neighbor's house. Mark stood in the basement, cornered. One of the figures stepped closer, and now he could see it more clearly. It looked almost human, but its mutilated face was unrecognizable. Shreds of skin hung loosely, and its eyes glowed with a dull, eerie white light. "What do you want?" Mark shouted, clutching the pipe as a weapon. The creature remained silent, raising one bony hand. In an instant, the flashlight went out, plunging the basement into total darkness. Mark heard something heavy hit the floor near him. The air grew thick, and breathing became difficult. He felt something icy brush against his arm, and suddenly his strength drained away. When Emily finally reached the neighbor's house, she pounded on the door in desperation. An older man, Mr. Craig, their only neighbor, opened the door. "What's going on?" he asked, startled by her panic. "Someone's in the house," she sobbed. "They took Mark." Mr. Craig didn't ask any more questions. He grabbed a flashlight and an old shotgun from his closet. "Stay here. I'll check it out," he said, heading toward the house. Mr. Craig moved cautiously, sweeping the flashlight beam over every corner of the yard. When he reached the Davis house, the front door was still ajar. Inside, chaos reigned, overturned furniture, shattered glass on the floor. "Mark?" he called out. "Anyone here?" Silence was his only reply. He moved further inside, toward the basement. A faint, unnatural glow caught his attention. When he descended the stairs, he froze. In the center of the basement, Mark sat on the floor. His eyes were wide open, and his lips moved in a whisper, repeating words too faint to understand. Symbols glowed dimly around him, etched into the floor with some eerie green light. "Mark?" Craig shouted, stepping closer. But a shadow detached itself from the wall and stood between them. The creature, as dark as the night itself, advanced on him. It raised a hand, and Craig felt the temperature drop rapidly. Without thinking, he fired the shotgun. The deafening roar echoed through the basement, but the pellets passed through the shadow, leaving it unharmed. The creature kept advancing, and suddenly every light in the house flared to life, blindingly bright. The shadow vanished, leaving behind only an icy chill. Craig rushed to Mark, shaking him by the shoulders. "Snap out of it, kid." But Mark didn't respond. He kept whispering. Emily waited anxiously in Craig's house, the minutes dragging on endlessly. When he finally returned, his face was pale, and his hands trembled. "What happened to Mark?" she demanded, jumping to her feet. He's not himself," Craig said quietly. "You need to leave, now. This place, it's not meant for people." Emily refused to abandon Mark. She returned to the house with Craig, but by the time they arrived, Mark was gone. The glowing symbols on the floor remained, faint, but still visible. From that night on, no one saw Emily again. The Davis house fell into disrepair, and the neighbors, who had once joked about its eerie atmosphere, now avoided it entirely. They said that on rainy nights, if you listened closely, you could still hear faint whispers calling someone's name. We came, the man stammered, barely able to form words. "We are the relatives of Elizabeth Ravenswood. Please, cremate her, as soon as possible. She mustn't remain here a minute longer, we beg you." Victor frowned. A strange request. Usually, relatives wanted one last look at the deceased, a final farewell. Some even requested to delay cremation for a few days. But here, it was the opposite. "I understand your concerns," he replied, choosing his words carefully. "But there are procedures we must follow. We're required to conduct a few checks." "No checks are necessary," the woman exclaimed, flinching. Her face remained shrouded by her hood, but there was a palpable fear in her voice. She must be burned today, immediately. The man nodded, swallowing with difficulty. "Forgive us," he said, looking directly at Victor. "But please, no one should look at her. No one should approach her body until the cremation." Victor noticed the man's fingers trembling. He couldn't tell if it was grief or fear, but in his eyes was a nervousness, a kind of desperation, as though they feared something beyond human comprehension. "I'll do my best," Victor said slowly, glancing quickly at the woman. "But you have to understand, we need to conduct at least a minimal examination." The man nodded again, his eyes darting to the side, as if checking to see if anyone was listening. There was no one else around, yet he lowered his voice to a barely audible whisper. "If you value your life, don't touch her. Just do what needs to be done and burn her, please. And, for heaven's sake, try to finish before midnight." Victor barely held back a smirk, but something in the man's tense expression kept him from showing it openly. He'd encountered superstitious people who sincerely believed that their dead relatives might return to the world of the living. However, this felt different. There was a suppressed panic emanating from these people, unsettling his thoughts. "All right, I'll do what I can," he concluded. When Victor entered the cold storage room, his eyes landed on a steel table covered with a thick black shroud, hiding the body of Elizabeth Ravenswood. At first glance, everything looked ordinary. He'd seen hundreds of bodies in this morgue. Nothing usually fazed him. But something felt off. A quiet, barely audible whisper seemed to come from the far corner of the room. Slowly he approached the table, pulled back the shroud, and froze. Elizabeth's body lay motionless, yet her eyes were wide open, staring unblinkingly, even though they should have closed her eyelids upon death. Those glassy, lifeless eyes were fixed upward, almost as if they were accusing. Victor instinctively stepped back, feeling an icy chill creep through him. Initially, he thought it was a trick of the light, but the longer he looked, the stronger his fear grew. He had the distinct impression that she could see him, that her eyes held something ancient and malevolent. "Burn her, as quickly as possible," he murmured to himself, repeating the strange words of her relatives. Suddenly, a quiet creak echoed behind him. Victor turned sharply and saw that the storage room door, which he was sure he had locked, was now slowly opening. Victor stood motionless, unable to take his eyes off the open door. A rush of cold air swept through the room, bringing with it something unexplainable, chilling him to the bone. He knew a simple draft couldn't unsettle him like this. There was something else at play, something unnatural. Forcing himself to remain calm, he walked over to the door and pushed it closed. Then he heard the whisper again, barely audible, as though it came from the depths of his mind. A whisper uttered a single word that echoed in his head. "Hurry." What the? Victor barely kept his panic at bay, glancing back at Elizabeth's body, feeling as though the whisper had come from her. But she lay there as still as before, her eyes glassy and staring at the ceiling. Victor blinked several times, trying to shake off this eerie sensation, telling himself that it was just the result of a stressful day and her relative's strange behavior. But as he looked again at the body, he noticed something unusual. Thin, dark lines began to appear on Elizabeth's pale, almost marble-like skin, as if ancient patterns or symbols were slowly surfacing. They traced the length of her arms and neck, like invisible ink gradually rising from within. Victor swallowed hard. All of this was becoming too strange, even for him. "All right, Pull it together, he whispered to himself. You just need to do your job. He decided to call for his assistant, Andrew, a young orderly who had been working in the morgue for less than a year, but was known for his calm demeanor and pragmatism. Maybe together they could handle this. Victor stepped into the hallway and, to his relief, saw Andrew sitting at the break room table. He entered, trying not to let his unease show. Andrew, could you give me a hand with Miss Ravenswood's body? Victor asked, keeping his tone steady. We need to prepare her for cremation, preferably quickly. Andrew looked up, raising his eyebrows slightly but didn't question it. He had been trained not to interfere in others' business, especially in the morgue. Of course, Dr. Grayson, he replied and stood. When they returned to the storage room, Victor was prepared for Elizabeth's unsettling appearance. But now, both he and Andrew could see that the dark patterns on her arms and neck had grown even more pronounced, forming something akin to ancient runic symbols. Andrew paled. Doctor, do you see that? He whispered, stepping back. On her skin, it looks like. I see it, Victor interrupted, trying to remain calm. But we don't have time to investigate. Our job is to follow her relatives' instructions. We need to take her to the crematorium as quickly as possible. Andrew nodded, still visibly shaken, and helped Victor transfer the body to a gurney. They covered her with a heavy black cloth, hiding the ominous symbols, and made their way to the crematorium in the basement. With each step down the narrow corridors of the basement, the tension within Victor grew. Andrew remained silent, clearly unsettled. When they reached the cremation chamber, Victor noticed that the same pair, Elizabeth's relatives, stood near the door, waiting, motionless and pale. "Have you brought her?" the man asked, his voice barely audible, full of hidden tension. "Yes, as promised," Victor replied, looking into the man's eyes. "Everything is ready for the cremation." The woman, who had been silent until then, took a step forward and spoke, her voice trembling. "Oh, please, do it quickly. We can't bear this curse any longer. We thought it left with her death, but it's coming back, stronger." Victor raised an eyebrow, but refrained from asking questions. This all felt like some kind of nightmare, but he just wanted to get it over with. He nodded at Andrew, who opened the massive door to the cremation chamber. The gurney, with Elizabeth Ravenswood's body rolled inside, and Victor placed his hand on the lever to start the furnace. He turned back to look at the relatives, their faces full of anticipation, and their eyes met. The woman seemed as though she wanted to say something, but merely raised a trembling hand to her mouth. Victor pulled the lever, and the furnace roared to life, the flames gradually engulfing Elizabeth's body. The room became stifling, yet Victor felt another kind of heat, one that had nothing to do with the fire. The silence was suddenly shattered by Andrew's voice, filled with terror. "Doctor, do you see that?" Victor turned toward the viewing glass and froze. Inside, within the flames, Elizabeth's body was not burning. It was rising, slowly and majestically, as though defying death itself. Her eyes opened, staring straight at them through the glass, and that same whisper Victor had heard in the storage room returned. The voice, filled with malice and icy hatred, spoke, "You won't get rid of me that easily." The horrifying whisper echoed through the crematorium. Victor felt cold sweat break out on his forehead as his heart began to pound. Beside him, Andrew stood frozen, his face twisted in horror, his gaze fixed on the furnace where, defying all logic, Elizabeth's body was slowly rising amidst the flames. This can't be," Victor whispered, his voice shaking. Elizabeth's eyes, wide open and filled with sinister resolve, were staring directly at them through the glass. It seemed as though the flames didn't touch her. Instead, they swirled around her, like clouds of smoke that she absorbed as if they were nourishing her. Her mouth opened, and a raspy, unnatural voice, laden with a deep, foreign accent, emerged. "You are all doomed. I've returned to claim what's mine." Victor barely regained his composure, and not taking his eyes off her, turned to her relatives, who stood by the wall, pale and overwhelmed by panic, as if what was happening had gone beyond their worst fears. What is this?" Victor rasped, feeling that he might lose consciousness. The man, bowing his head in what seemed like deep shame, spoke quietly. "We thought that death had taken her. We believed she would rest in peace. But now we understand that she's bound to our family. She is the curse we've been trying to escape. She claims our lives, returning to the world of the living, over and over." "You knew this, and you didn't tell us." Victor felt anger rising within him. "Then why did you bring her here, knowing that she—" The woman raised a trembling hand to stop him. "Please, Dr. Grayson, we had no choice. We were desperate. We thought cremation would free her spirit." But she swallowed, barely holding back tears. "If this doesn't stop her, then nothing will." Victor looked at Andrew. Though terrified, Andrew nodded, as if to say, "We need to see this through." He turned back to the glass. Meanwhile, in the cremation chamber, something unfathomable was occurring. Elizabeth's body had begun to change. Her skin grew dark and shriveled as if the fire was finally consuming her. But then, in an instant, a horrifying grin spread across her face, and a dark, shadowy figure separated from her body. A ghostly silhouette, hazy but no less terrifying. The figure inside the furnace began to move toward the walls, and Victor felt that it was about to break free. "Stop her!" the woman cried, collapsing to her knees. "Do something!" No longer able to simply watch, Victor rushed to the furnace controls and turned the temperature gauge to its maximum, doing everything he could to destroy the dark presence emanating from Elizabeth. Flames filled the chamber, but despite the unbearable heat, the shadowy figure continued to move, slowly reaching out toward the glass. Suddenly, Andrew remembered something left among Elizabeth's belongings by her relatives. He ran toward the door, sprinting back to the room where her things were kept. Victor called after him, "What are you doing, Andrew?" But there was no time for a response. Victor returned his attention to the furnace, praying his efforts would somehow be enough. A few minutes later, Andrew returned, holding an old leather medallion on a thin chain. The medallion looked antique, inscribed with symbols Victor couldn't recognize, but from which emanated a strange sense of ancient power. Her relatives left this among her belongings, Andrew explained, handing the medallion to Victor. They said it was a family relic, but didn't explain its purpose. Victor took the medallion, feeling its cold weight in his hands. He took a step toward the glass, raising it toward the figure behind the glass. "Maybe this is what can stop her," he muttered, with little hope. And then something unexpected happened. The shadow within the furnace froze, as though it sensed a threat. It turned its face toward the medallion, and on it was a look of horror mingled with hatred. "No!" The figure's piercing voice shattered the silence, echoing across the room. "You can't use that against me." But Victor kept holding the medallion up to the glass, uttering words that seemed to arise within him. "Let this curse touch no living soul. Let it burn away to ashes." Words he had never known slipped from his lips, and with every syllable, the shadow in the furnace seemed more helpless. It began to retreat, its form blurring until at last it vanished entirely, dissolving into the fire. When the figure disappeared, the flames in the chamber died down. Victor and Andrew stood in silence, realizing that this horrifying vision had finally gone. They exchanged glances, and Victor, barely able to believe it was over, exhaled deeply. I think it's over," he whispered, lowering the medallion and looking at what was left of Elizabeth Ravenswood's body. Now it appeared like ordinary remains engulfed by flames, without a trace of those eerie symbols. Elizabeth's relatives, trembling, approached. The man quietly asked, "Is she truly gone?" Victor nodded, unsure of what else to say. He simply returned the medallion to the man, who bowed and slipped it back into his pocket, avoiding Victor's gaze. In silence, they left the morgue, leaving Victor and Andrew alone with the heavy realization, a mystery they never should have touched.